So I'm gonna be doing a portrait using Conte, and I'm looking at the mirror, and I'm gonna just use white and black Conte. And I have a tone paper. This is not white paper, but fairly light gray paper. And I have another option over here. And I think I'm gonna use this. Because it's fairly light, it means that most of my shadows will be fairly dark, and then I will also use black for my middle tones. So I'm just gonna start drawing, and I'll talk about it as we go. I have a reference. I took a picture of myself in the corner. Where is it? Right there. And but I'm looking in the mirror because I think I can see a lot more when I'm drawing from the mirror. So my view might be slightly different from your view. So I think I'm gotta mark to myself where the visible part of the paper is. So I'm gonna make a portrait over here. So I have gestural lines for the placement. The thing about Conte, you can erase it, but you really want to draw the lines that you don't have to erase, because it's a little bit tougher to erase it. So I'm gonna draw things fairly light, and I will press down when I need to reinforce these lines. Here's the general gestural shape of my head. I will include the neck. Neck is not very long here. The shoulder comes almost at the same level as the chin. And then I get collarbone and the shoulder itself at that angle to the head. Can't see my right side right there. I'm gonna draw the temple bone and how my eye socket turns around. Here it's happening on this side, so it creates kind of an arc across with the whale's tail being over here, and I can clearly see the cheekbone with this lighting up in here, and I can even see it in the shadow because this plane is lighter than the top of the cheekbone. The base of the nose is the halfway towards the chin, but the tip of the nose is a bit higher. So I see a lot of the bottom of that shape of the nose in here. And in here I see the very clear cast shadow across the nose, close to the corner of the bridge of the nose. Here's the top plane and the box of the front of the nose like this. So I'm seeing shapes of light and shadow, and I am trying to find these structural relationships and foreshortenings kind of abstract way right now, and that's what's gonna give me likeness, I think. I can't move my mouth while I'm drawing it. So that shapes of my lips. Mustache. Here's my chin. Still fairly light. I mean, with the Conte, I can get a lot darker. You can see, yeah, it definitely looks a lot lighter on your the screen. And here it will give me plenty of room to get a lot darker. And here I have the top of my skull. Here coming in like this, around the cheekbone. I got the ear over there, around the mustache area. My face is a little bit skinnier. Something like that. And the hair keeps going in here. And on this side too. COVID-19 haircut going here. And here's the earlobe, and the hair goes just as low. So pretty much the larger shapes are established. There will be shapes of eyeballs, but those are details that are less important. Now I want to find the major core shadow line in there where the light separates the face into the shape of the light and the shape of the shadow. So I'll see that the hair has the core shadow with the cylindrical shape of the hair like this, and then it's casting a shadow, and then we see the core shadow. Now I want to draw that core shadow fairly soft, not as one edge, but rather kind of a broad, softer edge. And it goes down this way, goes with this protruding process, or the whale's tail as I call it. Comes around, goes around this way. And along the eyebrow, with the temple, around the eye socket, and here, and it's casting shadow across the cheekbone, along with the lower eyelid, and here, and joins with that cast shadow on the nose. Diagonally, that's the cast shadow all across over here. Then it's a core shadow on the side of the nose. And I can show a little bit the bony and the cartilage parts, so it changes in here to get a little bit more specific. But the lines get a little bit sharper because the transition is sharper right there on the tip of the nose. It's a little bit softer, and I can see it. And I can see it in the reference picture that the core shadow is darker than the area underneath the nose. And that's what really makes our drawing more three-dimensional. Even after I tone this in, I want to see that difference. Core shadow goes around the nostril. See how it travels around the whole face, separating it into two. We don't want to just find spots where we see it clearly and where we don't see it. We want to connect them together. We want to understand that logic. From below the nostril goes the cast shadow, and cast shadow will be fairly sharp and fairly dark, and especially it's going to be on top of fairly dark value hair. It's going to go now with a core shadow on the side of the lip, underneath the mustache, and it's going to come around like so. I think it's hard to tell in the picture. I'm kind of lifting my chin a little bit. Well, I think it's all in the shadow right here. Okay, it's all in the shadow. Keep it simple. Then it's probably gonna go across here, the edge of the head, and it's gonna cast a shadow across the neck this way. Core shadow across the muscle. There's a little bit light on the edge of the shirt, and the shirt has its own shadows, and the cast shadow right here. Can draw the other cast shadow over here, so the head is a mass and it's casting shadows down onto the form of the body. I want to get specific because those specific shapes have quite a bit of beauty to it. Now I'm going to use the broader side of this Conte, and I'm just going to tone this in. Now the hair could be a bit darker, but at first I just want to give a nice even tone. Even tone like this for the whole area of the shadow, separated from the area of the light. Taking it in steps, that step just simplifies everything, makes it visually closer to the masses that we see in real life. How we see things in terms of, I guess we don't see things in terms of flat shapes, but we do see things not in terms of lines so much, but rather in terms of values. So it's getting closer to the values that we actually see, and the kind of the lighting starts to emerge. That darker core shadow and that sense of light versus dark brings out some sense of lighting. It's these large abstract shapes that give us a sense of character. I want to go across the edges. I don't want to just fill in the shape of the face and the shape of the shirt. I want to just lose these borders in between, because the shadows don't stop at the edge of the t-shirt. They're kind of it's the same shadow in both. Okay, you can't even see that part. Do we see the edge of this shirt? Yes. So we're gonna have the edge of the shirt right there. Now I'm gonna go ahead and darken the hair a little bit too, just to start pushing it towards my darkest dark values, so I can see how far I want my values to go in the darks. So I'm gonna take that shadow part of the hair, darken it. Everything in the shadows appears slightly flatter than the things that are happening in the light. So I don't hesitate to make it look flatter. And in fact, I would suggest that you go ahead and, if you need to, you even smudge it to make it slightly flatter. And you should know that one thing about Conte that I mentioned in our Zoom meeting before is that Conte actually gets darker as you smudge it, unlike a lot of other charcoal materials, because charcoals usually just powder and you're kind of wiping off that dust off the paper. But Conte has waxy binding in it, so when you're smudging, it actually burns it into the paper. It's is more stickier to the paper, and it goes from higher points into the low points and doesn't really lift off with your finger as much. So you can see that it's getting a little bit darker as I smudge in here, not lighter like vine charcoal would, or even pressed charcoal. And I can get a little bit more even tone and a little bit less of the lighter low points of the paper in there. So I'm unifying everything, and I can get some middle tones that way too, half tones I should say, by going across a little bit. But I don't want you to overdo this part of smudging. You don't want it to look like lighter and darker spots. You want to be able to control it really well. It's much easier to control it with hatching than just smudging. Just overall quick evening out of the tones, and then I want to go back, find my jawline in here. I have hair on my beard. It's a darker local color. Let's find the eyebrows. Get even darker in some of these occlusion areas of the hair. In here, pushes all the values to even wider range. What's happening on the left side? I do have some shadows, but even besides the shadows, local tone of the hair is a lot darker than the skin, so I could bring the values in there too, and it kind of concludes a lot of what's missing in the drawing. The ear is partially in the shadow too, so that's something that I was missing. It's kind of blocked by my board. I'm looking around here in the cramped space. This is also in the shadow, the hair in the back over here. So we get something like this. The mustache, definitely, again, it's a different local color. Let me bring that in here. I'm looking at it as abstract shapes, but it brings the face out. Let me make it a little bit darker. And it's actually darker than the shadow of the skin in here still. Something like this. Also, the tone of my lower lip is darker. I guess my upper lip is catching a lot more of this reflected light off of the paper, off of my table in front of me. But the lower lip doesn't. It's a shadow above me, so it's darker. And the local color of it is darker than the rest of my skin around it, so it does look a little bit darker. Something like that. Now, I do, like I mentioned, on the upper lip, there's a little bit of a reflected light. The light bouncing, it's coming from the top, hits the table on the bottom, and bounces back into my face. So this whole cheek is a lot lighter than the top of that cheek on top. So if I darken all of this area, it's gonna make this dark value appear like it's glowing with a little bit of the light. So let me get that a little bit darker in there. definitely darker in the corner of the eye. It's a occlusion shadow in there. It's deeper in the space. This reflected light that comes from the bottom is blocked by the cheek. And also this mouth barrel is very round. The top of that round shape is catching less of the reflected light in the shadow area. So it's a little bit darker right here than the bottom of the nostrils because they're catching a lot of reflected light. So this middle part is very light. The only parts that are dark are these occlusion shadows that are deep in the middle. I'm gonna switch to a sharper point on the other end. I got the occlusion shadows. They're fairly dark. Got the core shadow that's dark. I got the cast shadow that's fairly dark underneath. And that makes the base of the nose underneath look like it's glowing with the reflected light a little bit. And that's all we need. We just need a little bit of that glow to make the lip a little bit darker. A little bit darker right here. Right here. Now we can start finessing things a little bit. Can get with the hair a little bit darker over here. Might not be in the reference, but it is in the mirror right there. Makes my neck a little bit skinnier. And cast shadow a little bit darker right here, and the whole neck is a little bit darker on this side. It's not facing towards anything that's lit up so much, so it is darker. Ambient occlusion underneath the shirt and the crevice right there, and the shirt should be lighter, but it is actually very close to my skin tones, despite being white shirt. I guess in some areas, like the areas over here, the cast shadow right next to the object that's casting it is a little bit darker. And that plane makes it seem like it's the same as the neck. There will be some other areas of the shadow. The throat. I just want to do not necessarily a detailed drawing, even though I would like to, but I don't want to make it too long. I do want to go over the light area and show what we're going to do over there. Thinking of the hair as geometric forms in here, more or less. The hair will have some basic tone to it, a little darker than the rest. Now in the forehead, I have a little line right here that is actually a middle tone. So I cast a shadow on my forehead by blocking the light, and I can tell that the shadows still make this darker once I cast the shadow in here. So it is a half tone. It is not a full shadow. It's coming across underneath the round portion of the head, these frontal lobe, It really is fairly round, and it's gonna go across, making this kind of a slow gradation towards the shadow. But first, what I want to do is I want to create a reference for myself for the light. How light am I gonna get? And I see a lot of glistening on my forehead over here. Notice that the reflected light is actually fairly small. The actual reflected light shape is really small. It appears to our eye oftentimes bigger than what it actually is. And then there's, more subtle light around it. But the strongest part of the reflected light, I guess I should say, is pretty small. There will be maybe a little bit of it here, but there wouldn't be too many areas of reflected light. So I got a little trail around the edge of the nose over here. I'm not going to make everything the same strength. I have to compare how strong these different areas are. So I think this is the strongest. And as it moves to the cheekbone, it's much weaker. I don't want them to be all the same value. That means that I kind of figured out that I need to darken a lot of areas around that highlight. So this is going to be my halftone. I'm still using the tone of the paper, but I do need to darken it to create the gradation from that highlight into the middle tones, into the shadow. And I see that that shadow gets very dark around the core shadow to create that sense of transition from light into the shadow, a gradual transition. This is the biggest round shape, and I need to show that soft gradation, those differences of 7 elements of light, how close they get, but how different they are from each other. So the core shadow needs to be reinforced a little bit. I see it getting closer to the hair value. So I constantly compare, but there is a little bit of reflected light in there. And core shadow, half tones. And that sense of roundness. Very light on this side. But I do need to round it off to make that look like it's turning, right? So let's do the same thing to the cheekbone. We got half tones, not exactly shadows, so that means that we got to get our shadows a little bit darker. Again, we have the occlusion around the eyelid areas and in that corner of the eye. This is the cast shadow. It's really dark. Of course, my eye is going to be really dark in there too. Something like this. And we can make something similar on the other side. Occlusion shadow in the corner of the eyes. So notice I'm not outlining everything, trying to delineate it. I'm really trying to work on the shapes that I see in there. Creates quite a bit of reflected light up in this part of the eye socket right there. Make that core shadow a little bit stronger. And the cheekbone, it's fairly dark middle tones as it goes down. The head has a form, it's lightest closer to the light source, and then it gets darker as it moves away. And around the nostril, this sinus pad, not even sure whether it's a shadow or a halftone. Really, it's a subtle shadow in there, and then it's slowly gradating towards the bottom here. Soft around the neck, but I need to separate it from the shadow. If I do get too dark in some areas, I get the kneaded eraser and I can start lightening it up. Okay. So we're very close to blocking in the whole of the major parts, and what's left is just going over, finessing things, and figuring out the more subtle relationships. And you can bring a charcoal pencil for that if you want to get more detailed. But we want to get the larger relationships first. The details of the ear inside, for example, there in the shadow, could get detailed. But you can leave it at more expressive. Here's the edge of the neck. Maybe what I'll do is I'll suggest the shadow in the background to show how much lighter it is, and maybe I'll make the shirt a little bit or a lot lighter. The shirt is white. Background there. So let me make the shirt a lot lighter. I definitely have a lot of white coming on this side. That makes drawing a lot more dynamic and rich. So I wanted to mention the last thing about using other charcoals that are available sometimes, the brown or red. I want you to make sure that you still think about the value relationship and the light logic, and don't get too carried away with the color and chasing the warm and cools in there. You can accent some things, like in my drawing. Maybe I would make the lips a little bit more brown or something, or maybe make the whole shadow brown, but not to get too caught up on putting the reds everywhere, because that would not help your drawing at all. So we got a little bit of light here, a lot more light on this side. Just making it more dense. Is it lighter than the highlight? It's almost the same. What is brighter? It really is the same. So it's that dense white. As much as we can get in there. So here, Here's pretty much a good start for the drawing. All right. And like I said, you can make it a lot more detailed and work on describing the forms a lot more. But what I want to see is 7 elements of light: highlight, light, the middle tone, the half tone, the core shadow, reflected light, the cast shadows. You can see them clearly. And the proportions are still there. They're large proportions. You're considering the relationship of sizes, the relationships of foreshortening, but also mainly what I really want you to consider is how do you find value relationships and the contrast that exists in there, and you do it on a larger scale. The great thing about divine charcoal is that a lot of value is already given to you. I didn't need to do anything with these areas of middle tone around the highlight. And those are pretty large areas that are already done for us. And even in the shadow, the value of the paper really helps us. All right. So that is it. Just choose your tone of the paper according to the environment that you have. If your paper is too light, that means that you would have to use a lot more darks. If it's too dark, that means that you will be using a lot of white charcoal. But be careful of mixing the charcoals together. Try to avoid of getting black and white mixed together to create a gray, because it kind of creates a very milky looking smudgy texture. You could make it work, but it doesn't create the same flickering that this kind of paper creates when you're just hitting the tops of the paper and do it in light layers. All right, thank you.